Hello and welcome back to the second episode of the Mum and Son Run podcast. In this episode, it's roles reversed and I talk about my journey into running, from reluctantly joining my mum on a park run wearing Vans and joggers to running the York Marathon last year in under 3 hours. We hope that you enjoy the episode. Let's get to it. We're back, episode 2. How are you, Mum?
Very well, thank you, son. And how are you?
Very well too. I know it's been a difficult week for you since the release of the first episode. You've been getting stopped in the street, asking for photographs and autographs. I heard one rumour that you've brought the headset back and people are starting to wear them again after watching the first episode of our podcast.
20 odd years, well, more than that actually, of working in the contact centre will mean that a headset is still part of my attire.
Yeah,
from time to time.
Just wearing it around the house.
Yeah.
Last week we touched on your journey into running and got some really good feedback on that. And there's Ollie the dog.
Yep, Oll's decided to. Well, he does come running with both of us, so
he does. So he's part of the journey. Maybe we'll get him more involved in the future, and he's probably likely to bark the house down at some point. So just to pre-warn anyone watching or listening, be careful because he could lose his shit at any minute. But yeah, last week we touched on your journey into running and got some really good feedback. And this week we're going to touch a little bit more into my journey, and it's very different. It's very different.
Yeah.
And it started for different reasons. It's taken me to different places. But yeah, hopefully it's relatable to people, as I know that your story was very relatable. So actually my journey kind of started intertwined with yours, because through my teenage years, there was a lot of you attempting to get me to run with you.
Attempting being the operative word.
Yeah.
And why didn't you ever take me? It's funny now, that you've become kind of so keen on running, but you just weren't interested at the time when I tried to foster some interest.
Well, as a 16-year-old boy, going running with your mum it was not classed as cool. I had my credibility to protect. But there were a few times that I actually did give in and allow you to book me into a race or drag me along to a park run. And the first time I ever raced, I can remember it very vividly because I ran it in a pair of joggers and Vans. You might remember this. It was Bramall Park Run.
I do.
I had a big pair of over-ear headphones on, and I remember just getting such weird looks and people staring at me and muttering under their breath, and I had no idea why at the time. But now if I saw me at a park run, the young me at a park run, I would probably mutter under my breath as well, because if somebody's overtaking you in Vans and joggers, that's not a good feeling. But that was my first ever run, and I loved the feeling of competing. I've always been competitive, but it just wasn't in running. It was always in football or basketball. But I wouldn't say I got a bug off the back of that, but eventually you paid for me to do the Manchester 10K and come in and run it with you. And you knocked on my door and I opened and you said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "What for?" And you said, "We're running the Manchester 10K today." And I said, and I'd been out until 3 a.m. the night before, back in my wilder days. And I grabbed my shoes, probably downed a glass of water, and off we went to run the Manchester 10K. So it's safe to say that that didn't really light a fire in me either. I'm not sure if you remember that.
Well, yeah, it's hard to forget when, you're there and you've done all your prep and you're very excited about, going and running one of my favourite races, and there is you paying it very little attention. I've paid for you to do it, and it is not a cheap run, that one. And there you are with your kind of, probably still had your joggers on. I'm not sure that you'd progressed much from the Bramall Park run.
Yeah,
I don't think you did it in Vans, but
no, I think I had a pair of Nike trainers, which was, Nike say that a lot of their trainers are running shoes, but they're actually not. So I think I grabbed the closest thing to a running shoe that I could find, and just headed out the door. But yeah, I think if you hadn't reminded me that, I think it cost like £32. I probably would have told you to do one when you knocked on my door. But I think the fact that you paid for it was the only reason that I went and did it. But I actually, again, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the atmosphere. I enjoyed competing against other people, although everybody will try and tell you, you know, it's you versus you. And for a lot of it is. But there's also something nice about, you know, being in competition against other people. But after that, I don't think I ran a race again for maybe 10 years. Um,
Yeah, well, I think your interest wasn't really there. I think I was kind of really pushing for you to have an interest because I hoped you'd kind of love it as much as I did. But in the very early days, it certainly didn't kind of look like you did.
yeah, it definitely didn't appeal to me in the early days. But then I'd say the point at which all of that changed was the lockdown, which is probably when a lot of people got into running or found the mental benefits of running because, you know, that period of time was unlike any other that most of us have lived through. Suddenly you're being told that you can't leave your house except for 1 hour a day. Going into that lockdown, I just prepared for a photo shoot for 16 weeks. So I had this really big goal that I was aiming for. And it was the day before we went into lockdown. And then the day after, I was locked down with no goals, nothing to aim for. And I don't do very well when I don't have something, you know, to shoot for in the distance. So for whatever reason, I decided that I was going to run a 10K every day of June. At this point, I hadn't really been running at all. I might have run the odd 5K, but I decided I was going to run 30 10Ks in a row and raise some money for the Calm charity, which is campaign against living miserably. So that was a different experience. You could say that I was like the hardest geezer before the hardest geezer, although he ran 50K a day across Africa and I ran
Yeah,
10K a day across Cheadle Hulme. But yeah, there's, you know,
slightly hard geezer, maybe.
yeah, softest geezer. But that was when I really stumbled across the mental benefits of running. It was a real outlet for me because, like a lot of people during that time, I was struggling. I was struggling with the gyms being closed, and you know the question marks over what was going to happen to my business. I was personal training in the gym, and then suddenly everything's closed, and you don't know what's going to happen next. So, with a lot of uncertainty, that those 10Ks in the morning, they just gave me like 45 to 50 minutes of thinking things through, or sometimes not thinking at all. That's the beauty of running, I guess, is sometimes the aim of a run is to go out and really think about something and maybe make a big decision. And sometimes the aim of a run is to go out and distract yourself and not think about anything at all. And, you know, I'd say I experienced a good mixture of those two across the 30 10Ks that I did at that time. Well, actually, it was 29 10Ks because on the 29th day, I was just under pounds donated for the Calm charity. So I put it out there that if the donations went above £1,500, I would run a half marathon on the last day. Now, the 10K was the longest distance I'd ever ran. So I wasn't even sure that I could finish a half marathon. I was going to say I hadn't really trained for it, but I don't know if running 29 10Ks in a row could be classed as a half marathon prep. But yeah, inevitably people wanted to see me suffer, and the donations came in, and we got over £1,500, and off I went on a half marathon.
Do you remember
And
where you ran?
I do. I ran the usual route and then up through Heel Green. I kind of just made it up as I went because I had no idea what a half marathon kind of felt like. So I obviously knew it was 13.1 miles, but I was just making it up as I went and hoping that by the time it finished, I was going to end up somewhere close to home. And luckily, I did. But yeah, that gave me a lot of purpose at that time, especially raising money for charity as well. And that really lit a fire in me to start thinking about running a marathon. But I don't think it was for maybe a year or two that I booked into my first marathon. And I remember speaking to you about potential first marathons. You didn't speak too highly of Manchester Marathon after your own experience, and you told me about the Loch Ness Marathon, which sounded pretty cool. It's scenic. It was somewhere different, and I wanted it to be. At that time in my head, I was thinking, I'll run one marathon, and then that's me done with running. You know, I can say I've done it, and then I'll hang up my running shoes. So I booked in for the Loch Ness Marathon and got training. And it's safe to say that I made plenty of mistakes during that marathon prep, from training mistakes to fueling mistakes to not taking any water with me on my 18 to 20 mile runs in the middle of summer, which is just, that's not a mistake. That's just stupidity on my part. I'm sure most people don't make that mistake. But yeah, it was a very memorable first marathon. It was a weird one, actually, because crossing the finish line was such a high. Like, you'll remember your crossing the finish line of yours, regardless of the result, it's a high that you've even managed to run that distance. But because I'd flown up to Loch Ness on my own, actually none of you guys were there. So it was kind of like, it was an amazing moment, but also a little bit anticlimactic. It felt like I should be celebrating with people, but instead I was just lay on a field with cramp, and I think a can of Heineken in my hand, which they handed out at the end of the race. But yeah, a memorable moment regardless. And yeah, that kind of lit the fire in me after that. When I made so many mistakes during that prep, I then wanted to become a little more clued up on the fueling side of things, the training side of things, and that kind of really made me want to be a strong runner. So I managed to finish that marathon in 3 hours and 23 minutes. So immediately I'm thinking that sub 3 hour mark is going to be achievable if I kind of stick to running and keep going. So that really lit the spark in me.
So when you did Loch Ness, I mean, you did all of your training, and you tend to do this. Our training is totally different in that I run quite a lot with people, especially on a long run. You train more or less on your own. Do you find that is that a conscious thing? And do you think that that gives you certain benefits, having that time running on your own?
Yeah, it is quite a conscious thing, because even when it comes to training in the gym, I've always trained alone in the gym as well. Because exercise to me, and it sounds a bit cliche, is a bit like my meditation. It's almost like forced meditation. You know, when you're in the middle of a tough run, or when you're in the middle of a tough workout, you can't think about the other things that are going on in your life, because, you're either going to end up crushed under a barbell, or, you're going to end up performing at a lower, intensity, because you're not fully focused in the run. So that's what I've always loved about exercise. Is I tend to be a bit of an overthinker. So if I'm in the gym or I'm running, I have to really focus on one thing. So I can't be wandering off thinking about everything else, thinking about work and everything going on in my life. But I'd say there are certain benefits to training solo, and plenty of benefits to training alongside people as well. For me, I'm quite a good motivator of myself, so I don't really need somebody else next to me saying, keep going, because I'm in my own head already having those conversations. I also think it just allows my training to be tailored to me. I think if I'm training with a group of people, you might run at the pace of the person who's slowest. Or if you're running with a lot of people who are quicker than you might be running quicker on an easy run than you'd intended to, because you're keeping up with everybody else. So that's the one drawback, I'd say, when people ask me about run clubs and running in groups is, and I know run clubs cater to different speeds and, have become quite good at separating it into almost experience levels or speed. But I really like, when I'm out, I really want to hit the splits that I'm planning on hitting. I like to make sure that the workout is as intentional as it can be. So if it's an easy run, I want to come away from it thinking that was easy for me. If it's, a tempo run, I want to come away thinking I hit my splits. And yeah, I would say almost all of my training has been solo, other than when I joined the run club in Bali, which was really eye-opening for me because I think I'd been quite closed off to the community side of running. I'd seen you go to run clubs for years and years, and the benefits that it had on your social life and how good it was for consistency and accountability. But I'd never really connected the dots of like that I could have that community as well. So after the Loch Ness Marathon, I went traveling again and ended up in Bali and joined a run club out there with some friends. And I really loved it. Like, that's my first taste of kind of having a community around me, waking up every day and meeting down by the beach and heading off on a run, running with people that was faster than me. So I'd always thought maybe that would negatively impact my training, when in actual fact it's for me that kind of fuel that I needed to think, okay, there really are levels to running, and this is where I can get if I stick at it. So I was running with a lot of sub 3 hour marathon runners. I was running with some sub 2:45 marathon runners, and that really gave me the boost that I needed. And that's when I really started looking into becoming a running coach. So obviously when I first got into coaching, it was all kind of lifestyle coaching, helping people to lose weight, helping people to build muscle, just helping people live happier and healthier lives. It didn't have to revolve around weight loss or muscle gain. But once I really got into running and felt the benefits of running marathons and like the purpose that gives you, the resilience that builds, I then had this thought of like, I could help other people to do that. So that's where the idea of becoming a running coach came in. And that really changed my the pathway of my career, really. But training out in Bali got me fired up to run another marathon, and I booked the Milton Keynes marathon whilst I was traveling. So then I immediately started to train for it in Bali. I then went on to Australia and did a lot of my marathon prep in Australia.
Tell us a bit about why you chose Milton Keynes, because somebody might be listening thinking, Milton Keynes, that's a strange marathon. Of all the glamorous marathons that there are around the world, and I don't want to diss anybody from Milton Keynes because I actually really like it. I love all the roundabouts and I love that grid system.
Yeah.
But it might seem a strange choice. So why Milton Keynes?
Yeah. People probably are thinking, so you went from Loch Ness to Milton Keynes, and yeah, you'd be right to question that. But so our family, your sister, lives in Northampton or just outside of Northampton. So I was looking at marathons. So when it comes to kind of choosing a marathon, I was thinking, well, I want to run sub 3 hours. The criteria was that it's flat, and a lot of the UK marathons were already booked up. And then I stumbled across Milton Keynes Marathon. I thought I can kill two birds with one stone. And after running the Loch Ness Marathon with nobody there to kind of support from my family or friends, I thought it'd be really nice if I ran like a marathon close to my family, because all of you guys could come down. Auntie Al and the girls and Uncle Mike could be there as well. So it made sense. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily that it was, had these huge landmarks or that I'd heard anything great about it. Not that it wasn't great. It was well ran, but my performance in that marathon, we'll talk about that in a second, I guess. But it was just so that I could have all of you guys there, and that brought a real different element to marathon day. So yeah, Milton Keynes Marathon soon came around after training throughout traveling. So doing a lot of my longer runs in Australia. I had a slight injury throughout the marathon prep, which hindered me. I didn't kind of realize how much it hindered me until I ran the marathon. And we're going to touch on injuries in the next episode, actually. So I'm not going to talk too much about the issues that I had through that prep, because we will touch on that in detail in the next episode. But yeah, Milton Keynes started off well. I had my doubts on the start line because of the injury, but I was feeling pretty good on the day. I'd had a lot of physio and been looking after myself a bit to try and get myself fit for the race day. But I just ran out of gas at mile 22, I would say, and hit the wall, which is something we'll probably talk about as well in another episode, because I think that's one of the biggest fears that people who run marathons have, is kind of, you hear a lot of people talking about hitting the wall, but ultimately it doesn't have to happen if you do the right things. And all of those little mistakes that I made across the first 2 marathons were what kind of drove me to become a run coach and really learn about how to fuel properly and how to get yourself properly prepared so that you can actually run a marathon, but also enjoy it. Because if you are running it injured, or if you are kind of underprepared, it's not a very fun experience. You might look back on it afterwards and see it in a different way, but the actual running of the marathon will be a bit of a living hell. Mile 22 of Milton Keynes, I start to cramp up. Every stride starts to feel harder and harder. I managed to cross the finish line in 3 hours and 9 minutes. So actually, maybe a 14-minute PB from the Loch Ness Marathon, but I was so disappointed. That was like a complete different feeling to Loch Ness, where I hadn't put lots of pressure on time. I didn't know what I was capable of. It was all an unknown. It was really about finishing it and just enjoying my first experience of the marathon, whereas my intention has changed for the second marathon. I thought I could run sub 3 hours, and I made it all about time, and I put a lot of pressure on myself to hit that. I told all my family and friends that was what I was aiming for. I spoke on my social media about what I was aiming for. So I think I really built up the pressure of, oh, if I don't run this marathon in under 3 hours, then this is going to feel like a failure. So on the one hand,
looking back though, James, do you think that like it was an opportunity for you to learn, about marathon running, warts and all?
yeah, it was. It taught me a lot. Each marathon that I've run has taught me a lot of different things. You'll never have 2 marathons the same. But the Milton Keynes Marathon really taught me about the importance of kind of doing the smaller things, of making sure you're stretching, of making sure you're warming up, of making sure that if you've got an injury, you take it seriously when it first arises and don't continue to just, smash through the injury thinking, if I do less now, that's going to impact me on race day. And we will touch on this more. But, I was listening to Paula Radcliffe's podcast recently, and she said, you're much better turning up on the start line slightly less fit, but not injured, than being injured, but being slightly fitter. And I didn't know that at the time. So I let that injury plague me throughout my marathon prep. And yeah, I would say that that was probably the reason that I didn't hit that sub 3 hour mark, but it taught me so much. So my perspective of it now is that it's such a valuable lesson. It taught me a lot about fueling. It taught me a lot about what I could do better in my own training. I don't think I'd done enough long runs in the build up to that marathon. So I think that getting to mile 22 just felt so alien to my legs that, when I got to that point, my body just didn't know how to handle it. So yeah, it definitely taught me a whole lot. And that then led me into feeling like I had unfinished business with the marathon. So actually 2 weeks after the Milton Keynes Marathon, we'd both signed up for a ultra marathon. So we didn't have a huge turnover after that race finishing. So I had to go straight into rest and recovery. I think I did a couple of easy runs before that ultra marathon, but I kind of treated the Milton Keynes Marathon as a kind of training run for the ultra, and it doesn't quite go hand in hand because I raced it, whereas an ultra marathon, you're not really thinking about pace at all, or I wasn't. Again, it took me back to just finishing, and we'll touch more on the ultra marathon in a separate episode because we both had very different experiences that day, and it's worthy of its own episode. But I felt like I had unfinished business after the Milton Keynes Marathon. So I think within a couple of weeks, I booked the York Marathon, and my sights were set on running that marathon and running sub 3.
No, that's me.
Definitely sub
That's
4.
me. I'm the sub 4 runner. Well, just once, but you're definitely not the sub 4 runner. But
Yeah.
you, yeah, you were very determined. I remember, you saw Milton Keynes. I'm not going to say you saw it as a failure. I mean, I think you should be incredibly proud of running, anybody that runs that distance, whatever time they generate. I think it's easy to forget just what a stress on your body 26.2 miles is, because there are so many marathons, and so it looks like so many people run marathons when actually I think the percentage of people that run marathons, it's around 1% of the population that have run a marathon. I'm pretty sure that's so that means the same crazy people are running them over and over again, I think. So, you should be really proud of both your Loch Ness and your Milton Keynes marathons. Just because they're not the time that you wanted doesn't make them any less of an achievement, not in my eyes anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I see it that way now, but I definitely didn't at the time. The competitive kind of side to me saw it as a bit of a failure that you didn't live up to the potential of, that you had for that race. So I used it as fuel. And I say this to people, like I say it to my clients of let the runs that don't go to plan. I don't necessarily want to call them bad runs because every run gives you something, a lesson of some kind, a little bit of fitness, whatever it might be. Every run gives you something and is a building block to where you want to go. But I let that run fuel me positively and let me be competitive and to hold me accountable during my next marathon preps. For the next marathon, the York Marathon, I hired a coach. So I really wanted to take it seriously. I ended up working with a guy called Ross, who was an Olympian, which was pretty cool to have him in my corner. And he really set the standard. And it was different from the first two marathons of kind of following a rigid training plan. So for the first marathon, I bought a plan off Training Peaks, which was just a generic plan. For the second marathon, I used the Runner app, which was, again, quite generic. Wasn't built for me and what I needed and the mileage that I could run each week. So I thought this time I really want to do it properly. If you're going for a sub 3 marathon, you need to treat it with the respect that it deserves. So I hired Ross, and Ross set the tone early. He put me through my paces. He had me do some of the hardest runs that I've ever done during that prep. He had me do lots of long runs. So every long run on a Sunday during that prep was 18 miles or more, going up to 24 miles at one point, which is something I'd never done in a marathon prep. But I felt so confident going into York because of those long runs, because of those hard runs that I'd done during that marathon prep. I just felt like I had so much experience to lean on. Not only the first two marathons, but all of the preparations, all of the tough moments that I'd ran through really had built my confidence. So the feeling going into the York Marathon was completely different to the other two. I knew that I was physically capable and that mentally I would need to lock in, as you always do with a marathon. Nobody ever just breezes through a marathon and, crosses the finish line going, oh, well, that went completely to plan throughout the whole thing. There's always an obstacle to run through. But it's safe to say that York, out of the three, actually gave me the biggest challenges. Almost nothing went to plan that day. And from the very off, I almost felt that I was destined to fail again. I got to the start line early enough, but there were maybe 10 to 15 portaloos and thousands of people. So I found myself in a queue for a portaloo as the tannoy is going off saying the race starts in 2 minutes. So already, that's not good for nerves or anxiety. So your adrenaline's up, you're thinking, oh God, the race is going to start. And as I'm coming out of the portaloo, I hear 3, 2, 1, and the race starts. And I run out into the crowd, and I'm stood behind the 4-hour, 30-minute pacer. And the drop that I had in mood, in energy, was just like, it was huge. I instantly thought, no, this is not going to happen, because there's narrow streets at the start of the York Marathon and everybody's setting into their pace. It was my own fault ultimately, but instantly I had my back against the wall and I'm trying to overtake people, but everybody's running at maybe, a 9:30-minute mile at that point, because their aim is to run a 4:30 marathon. So the first half of that race was probably the most mentally challenging I've had of any run, because I was telling myself over and over again, you've messed it up. This isn't going to happen. I had a lot of negative voices going through my head, which I hadn't experienced in the other two. Milton Keynes didn't go to plan, but I knew that I'd maxed out my potential that day. I couldn't give any more. I'd hit the wall and that was it. But with York, I felt like it was almost out of my control at that point. I don't know why I was telling myself that, but you just get those negative inner voices. And we spoke about it last week of you hitting that point in the Manchester Marathon, and I asked you whether it was psychological or whether it was physical. And the psychological side can hinder you just as much as the physical side. You can be more than ready to run your goal pace, but your mind is the thing that gets in the way of it.
You didn't ring me though, did you?
I didn't ring you, so no.
It wasn't that bad.
No, I should have really repaid the
But
favour.
how did you? Yeah, you should have done. How did you turn those negative voices in your head then into positive thoughts? Or did you? Did you turn them into positive thoughts even?
For the first half of the race, I didn't turn them into positive thoughts. I was using the negativity to actually fuel me, which I wouldn't suggest to people, but it can actually be a powerful motivator to feel like your back's against the wall and to feel like everything's going wrong. And I won't go into too much detail, but anyone who runs marathons will know that gastrointestinal issues are a big part of marathon running when you're taking gels, and they don't always agree with you. And I had serious stomach pains whilst I was running for the first half. So not only was my mind screaming at me, my stomach was screaming at me as well. And I told myself, if I stop to jump into a portaloo, then my goal is over. There's no way that I was already behind, because I'd started so far behind where I was supposed to. So a few of my early miles were much slower than they needed to be. So I felt like my back was against the wall, and I thought, if I stop, I'm not going to make it. And eventually, about mile 12, I kind of gave in, and I said, right, I'm just going to use the toilet. And again, not too many details, but I came out of that portaloo a changed man, and something had changed, because
Like Superman.
Like Superman, Clark Kent
coming out the cellar,
going into a portaloo, coming out. But do you know what it was? It was that not that I'd given up, but the pressure was almost off.
Yeah.
Because I'd accepted that if I stopped, I wasn't going to make it, because that's another minute or two that I was going to have to make up in those later miles. And I just came out and I said, okay, I'm not going to miss a single split for the rest of this marathon. And where that leaves me where it leaves me. I'm just going to give it everything I've got from this mile onwards. And this was around the 12 or 13 mile mark. And then I just fully settled in, and the gastrointestinal issues died off. and the voices in my head died off. And before I knew it, I was just running, and it was a completely different race. So I guess this is a bit of a lesson for anyone listening or watching that's running a marathon, that's got one coming up soon maybe. You know, it's not always how the race starts, it's how you finish. And, you know, you can be telling yourself you've not got it, it's not going to happen. We've both experienced it. You know, that voice in your head saying, this isn't going well, give up, stop. But if you push through to a certain point and just keep saying no and just keep running the mile that you're in and ticking those miles off, something changes and you get more confidence with every mile. And I ended up running a huge negative split. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, that basically means you run the second half of the race quicker than the first. And I ran a big negative split and I came across the finish line in 2:57, which, considering everything that had gone wrong,
Woo!
yeah. Do you remember what I asked you to shout at me on the side of the
Yeah,
road? It's a
yeah.
bit
So
psychotic, but it's quite funny.
at mile 24, we were waiting and you ran up and you'd asked me to shout, if you don't finish in under 3 hours, I'm disowning you as my son. So I shouted at the top of my voice those very words, and there were people stood all around me, were absolutely roaring, laughing. And I had to kind of say to them, look, he did ask me to shout that at him. I'm not really going to disown him as my son. But yeah, it was pretty phenomenal to kind of see you come running up the road. You know, we kind of I'd seen you there at Milton Keynes, you know, and the disappointment on your face when you ran into the MK Dons Stadium, which was a pretty cool end to a race actually. And
It
I did the
was.
half marathon that day, the day that you did the marathon. Pretty cool to run around the MK Dons Stadium. So I'd seen that disappointment on your face as you kind of came running in. So to see you run down the road and know, because we actually it was more than mile 24. It was
It
must have been
was
mile 25.
it
Yeah,
was
because
right
you
near the finish line because I remember I
yeah, it
hadn't
was.
seen you throughout the whole
Yeah,
race. So
yeah, we knew.
it
Yeah,
was
we'd
quite
walked
a
up to the finish.
logistical nightmare, wasn't it? And the weather was awful. That was
The
another
weather
thing
was
that I haven't mentioned is
yeah,
like it was a moderate weather warning and the final 10K of the race was into a
yeah,
strong headwind. And I just
headwind, yeah,
even that didn't deter me. Once I just locked into I'm giving it everything, and where that leaves me, that leaves me. It really didn't matter whether it was up a hill, down a hill, a wind into my face, or whatever. But I did start to think, where are they? Because I needed that boost. I wanted that boost of seeing my family. But actually, when I saw you at it was kind of midway through the 25th mile, it was just around the last bend before
possibly,
the finish line.
yeah,
And I knew I was going to do it. I knew I was going to run sub 3. So when I saw you, I got this big surge of emotion and adrenaline, and it really just spurred me on around that last corner because little did I know there was quite a big hill around that corner. And hearing you shout that you were going to disown me just give me that little boost that I needed to get up that hill
yeah.
across the finish
I'm
line.
so glad. Yeah, it was a proud moment for not only you, but for, you know, if your family watching, it's such a proud moment just to, regardless of time, you
Hmm.
know, time is just one element of it, just that whole achievement and the opportunity. I know I talked obviously last week about my kind of, you know, my relationship with people cheering on at a marathon. So it's, I suppose, a little contradictory to say that I love being the one that does the cheering. You know, there's
Yeah.
nothing better than seeing somebody that just looks like they need that boost and just giving them a bit of a cheer.
Yeah, a lot of people agreed with you actually that unless they can see the
Yeah,
finish line, they don't want
saw that.
anybody telling them that they're
No,
almost
no,
there
they
or
don't need to wear. There's only a part run to go and they don't want to be cheered on. But, you know, I think after it's finished, you do appreciate people coming out and cheering you on, especially if you know people in that crowd and they're giving you a special mention.
yeah, it means a lot. It means a lot to run past people that you know and have them there supporting
Yeah,
and yeah, it definitely gave me that last boost to get over the finish line and
yeah,
it was
yeah,
it was a nice feeling to know that despite it's feeling like things were against me, that I could dig deep, and it didn't dictate how that marathon went. So yeah, that was the last marathon that I ran at the end of last year, and I'm currently looking for my next marathon, but that kind of brings me up to date. So that's pretty much my journey into running.
A short and quite sweet marathon career. And can I just say that Ollie is now snoring, so he's obviously not impressed with anything
Yeah,
that you've been talking about.
no, he's
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 snoring away here.
he's not
Yeah,
interested in the slightest, but he's a good dog to
no,
train with during a marathon prep.
phenomenal,
Yeah,
phenomenal. We should definitely do an episode on running with Ollie. Running with a dog is just, well, I think it's brilliant. You're not always
I'm
so
not
keen, but
so keen now,
yeah,
but
but I really enjoy it.
yeah, yeah, he can be all right when he wants to be.
Spaniels are phenomenal runners. I think they've got a VO2 max that's something like 3 or 4 times a human's.
Oh,
It's
if you're
just
running 18
unbelievable.
miles, he's running 30.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, definitely,
pretty
definitely. But
incredible.
yeah, it's yeah, like I say, a short and sweet so far. But your best
Yeah,
years are definitely ahead of you.
yeah,
Already some phenomenal achievements for you. And we haven't, as you say, we're going to kind of talk about our experiences in the Keswick Mountain Festival, UK, on another episode,
yeah,
and there's the craziness of running for you. One minute you're doing a park run, and the next minute you're there running up mountains, or not running up mountains in my case, but
it can take you to some pretty special places, can't it?
definitely. Yeah.
And I think that ties it up nicely. I've had enough of talking about myself, and I'm sure everybody else has had enough of hearing me talk about myself. But hopefully that those two first episodes give people a good idea of our journeys into running, and the experiences up and down that we've had so far. But there's plenty more to come, and I'm sure we'll be documenting them along the way through this podcast. But yeah, if you've been listening, I hope you've enjoyed it. If hit the like and subscribe button and all that other stuff that I'm supposed to tell you to do as a person who has a podcast, and we will speak to you next week. Thank you, Mother.
Thank you, son.